Hello, I'm Mark Stavish, the founder and director of studies of the Institute for Hermetic Studies. And here we have another conversation from the edge with John White, uh, a board member of the Institute for Hermetic Studies, who was a presenter at this year's conference. And his presentation on Jungian psychology was a big hit, in particular because he helped us understand why we love to hate Jung and hate to love him. So we're going to follow up on that and see where we can go. John, thank you very much for being here with us.
Oh, you're very welcome. I appreciate the invitation.
Now, I hope that everyone can hear my dog barking in the background because it is a Monday and dogs are part of Monday. So with that, the joy of everyone being at home, right? So let's go forward. Maybe we could do a little capsulation of your presentation. What was the nut of it that you see as most important about people to understand about Jung?
Well, Jung, of course, has a lot of cachet in the esoteric world, and rightly so. The main thing I wanted to talk about in the presentation was some of the limits of his understanding of alchemy. Jung brought alchemy into popularity in a lot of ways, or out of obscurity into something that was studied a good deal. But I think Jung was kind of bogged down by too much of an association of alchemy with his theory of projection. So presumably everybody understands that projection is the idea that certain unconscious experiences of ourselves are experienced outside ourselves when we don't deal with them within. For that reason, Jung tended to think that alchemy, with all of its fantasy and what he considered to be wild fantasy, must be projection. I instead think that Jung should have chosen a different idea of his to help him understand alchemy, which is this notion of adaptation. For him, adaptation is always about both having adaptive problems in the outer world and expanding your inner world in order to make the adaptation to the outer world. If one sees it that way, one can understand alchemy, both laboratory alchemy and inner alchemy, is primarily about expanding one's adaptive potential. If you like the word evolution, which is the common word nowadays, you can use that. But I think understanding it as the expansion of adaptive potential would be better. And I think that's a better way of understanding alchemy. I think Jung could have used that rather than his theory of projection, since it's his own doctrine of adaptation. Some reason he just couldn't seem to get beyond the idea of the fantasies themselves, which is, of course, one of the risks of anybody who works in the psychoanalytic field. To find that the fantasies themselves are so fascinating that they don't necessarily get out of them and reflect on them in maybe more fruitful ways. So I would say the nub of my presentation is to understand alchemy not in Jungian terms as projection, but rather as the goal of expanding adaptive potential. Mark, you're muted. I can't hear you. Sorry.
That notion of adaptation is very important because, being married to a biologist, it's always a notion of what is evolution. And people make the mistake of evolution being a collective or group process rather than being that of individual organisms and an individual process. And what evolution is adapting to your circumstance, to your environment. And the more I explain that to people, that life is about adaptation, particularly when we see a lot of people bemoaning situations. And they're right, that this situation is not ideal. This situation is not like what it was. This is very difficult. But let's keep two things clear. Life is about adaptation and life is cruel. And life lives off life, as they say in Indian philosophy. And that these two things seem to be a forgotten fundamental truth in esoteric practices and psychology and life as a whole, along with a third one, which is the miracle of compound interest, which means good actions multiply over time and bad actions multiply over time. And you cannot escape the consequences of your choices, no matter how much you want to. So these three ideas all come down to something that we briefly discussed before the beginning, which is about judgment, or what we call on the path discrimination, the first virtue.
Yes.
Maybe you could pick up on that and go with that for a little bit.
Sure. There's almost too much to talk about there, but I think to understand adaptation as both learning how to deal with one's environment, but also to take every occasion of environmental challenge as a possibility for expanding and challenging oneself is kind of the crucial point there. Life is hard. There's a lot of struggle. Survival of the fittest is, as I talked about in the presentation, I think best understood as survival of the most adaptive, where adaptive means both dealing with the external issues, but taking every external challenge and struggle as an opportunity for my growth. If I do that, I think it's a lot like the old esoteric idea that, take every event as if it's God speaking to you. That is, drawing from the outer challenge something that's actually makes me more expansive in some way. And I think I think that's another piece of that evolutionary problem that you brought up, that on the one hand, people tend to think of it as primarily collective, but I think because they think of it as collective, they also think of it as automatic. Like it's just something that I'm just sort of allowing to happen in me. Adaptation doesn't just happen in you. And it's one of the basic, I think, insights that both Freud and Jung had is that if we don't expand inner potential, they wouldn't put it this way necessarily, incidentally, but that if we don't expand inner potential, we just tend to have what Freud called a repetition compulsion. That is, we find ourselves putting ourselves in the same situation over and over again until we learn the lesson. So I think that there's the psychological observation that tends to happen is also the observation that unless we take those challenges as occasions for expanding our adaptive potential and we do something about that, we're going to find that those same negative problems just happen over and over again because we haven't turned their negativity into something positive.
Let's look at that, because the notion is then of karma. Karma is habit. It is a memory that we keep going over and over. It's like Groundhog Day. We have a force moving in a direction. That force becomes a habit. That habit becomes a way of engaging with life over and over and over again. And we have to break that habit. We have to create new karma or force or action for ourselves. And with that, we see the notion of discrimination and intellectual development, actualizing our potential from the within. Because at the end of the days, that's all we take with us,
Right.
is our capacity for inner awareness. And that is, and then of course we can expand on that to very profound lengths in terms of whether it's the yogas and Dzogchen and the body of light and the rainbow body or the philosopher's stone and all that. But at the end of the day, you don't get there if you're stupid.
Yeah, right.
You have to develop the ability to make good decisions where you know the consequences or have a general notion of what the consequences of these actions will or may possibly be. And that the enhancement of yourself on a what we would call intellectual level, inwardly rather than intellectually, and some standard outwardly, is really what we're talking about here.
I think that's right. There's a kind of the kind of discernment here that I think is particularly relevant is the kind where I guess in a very common situation, you have some kind of external problem, and your first feeling about it is frustration. If all you do is then just try to be rid of the frustration, you haven't learned anything from it. If instead the frustration you take as a signal to the need for greater consciousness, then you can do something with it. And that's part of the expansion I think you're talking about, and the kind of intelligence that you're talking about. Because that means that I'm not only looking at it as some outward thing that happened to me, which is usually why the frustration is there. Yes, it happened to you, but you haven't ceased being an agent. The point is, how do I become an agent in all of this? How do I make myself more conscious of what the situation means? How am I contributing to the problem? So that's not just something that happens to me, but it may be, as you say, consequences of my own decisions. And when you make a decision, you also make a decision for the consequences, including the ones you don't know. So you always have to be expanding adaptive potential any time that you actually make a full-blown decision, which I think a lot of us actually don't. I think a lot of us just muddle through. But what we're talking about here, I think, is something where that expansion and that kind of inner discernment of where am I lacking something so that I can expand and not only deal with the outer adaptive problem, but take it as an indication of how I need to expand and can expand. And then it's actually at the service of my future. It's at the service of a lot more things that I can do. It may well mean that the universe delivers more challenges to me, but that's part of the point and supposedly part of the journey of it. This is why the hero's journey is so much the archetype of what we do.
I think that's a great point because, 2020 was very difficult for many people. As I used to say, you've been mugged by Saturn. And quite frankly, I mean, I saw a lot of people that I went to college with posting on social media about how, unfair the world is. And, I'd say to them, you know what? You're almost 60 years old and you spent a lot of money over the last 40 years or 50 years even on alcohol, tobacco, porn, entertainment, and maybe an occasional tattoo. Had you invested even a third of that, you would be financially better off. Now, of course, that doesn't change. They'll ignore that and they'll talk about, well, this is unfair. Maybe it is, but you're not landing on a beach of northern France this June 6th either, or you're not like my first boss who spent 1938 to 1945, in one military or the other on the Eastern Front, where your chance of survival was less than 10%. Yeah, not to always go to an extreme let's put these things in perspective. People make bad decisions and they compound. People make good decisions and they compound. And that when people go to magic, esotericism, they're going there because they don't like their lives. They want something different or better. And they tend to lie about that. And they tend to think that the world should be nice to them because they just want to be nice and be left alone to live in their dream world and get by. And then they get upset that life doesn't let them just get by, because magic actually stirs things up. And George Hansen's book, The Trickster and the Paranormal, talks a lot about what happens when you try to live on the liminal edge. You're constantly in a state of almost vulnerability to disruption. And many of the spiritual teachers that I've talked to, the warning was, it always is. Now, before you do this, remember, there's going to be big disruption as a result of this, because you have to shake things up in order for them to change. Maybe we could comment on that for a bit.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. And I even see that as an analyst and as a therapist, is that how often this repetition that we've talked about, this lack of expanding adaptive potential, is partially because people want to change it without changing anything else in their lives. And so their lives are surrounded. There's a whole aura of awful energy around them, which they don't want to change. They think simply it's an internal change. That also shows the adaptive part of it, that it's about both outer and inner. And as you're saying, you do stir things up. Everything gets stirred up, of course, when you move towards an esoteric approach to life. And there are people then that think, well, I just want to increase my power over life, but I don't want life to change fundamentally. And that it just doesn't work that way. That's why I think this is also why I like Jung's idea of adaptation, or at least this version of adaptation, because where it really demands that you not only understand outer problems, but understand, how do I contribute to that? How do I stop contributing to the disruption? And how do I expand in a way that I don't have that kind of disruption anymore? So the expansiveness of all of this, I think, is absolutely crucial. And when you don't do that, I think this is, when you're talking about people you've known from high school and stuff, you can see where there's a certain set of habits that I don't want to trace it all to this, but I think the habits of consumerism are one of the things that really get in the way of this. There's a tendency, if you do any study of the psychology of the advertising industry, that part of what it tries to do is try to actually increase your sense of frustration, and then to tell you solve the frustration problem by buying something. If you don't become conscious that that's the habits that you're developing by living in the midst of this culture, and you don't positively resist it, I think you become subject to it. Then you think that frustration is always a problem. But frustration is not meant to be a problem. It's meant to be a signal. This is an opportunity for you to expand. Instead of expanding, we deaden it through purchasing further things.
That goes with two things. One is the book, The Gift of Fear. And I remember telling people, fear is a signal that something dangerous is happening around you. Pay attention to it. And I would have all these new agers. So, fear is just, fear is a gift. Fear is telling you, it's like pain. Pain is telling you that there's something wrong and you
Yes.
need to pay attention to it. So there's that denial of the profound duality that we exist in, the profound extremes that we move between,
Yeah.
and that we have to accept these extremes as the framework within which we expand our potentiality
Yes.
rather than just run from them.
I think that's right. Yeah. Well, it's one of those ways too, where people have the idea that the only real experiences are pleasure and pain, and if it's pain, it must be negative. If it's pleasure, it must be good. And I think anybody knows who, knows anything about the philosophical tradition, knows anything about psychology, is that pleasure and pain are not very good indicators of much. Sometimes pain is exactly what you need, and sometimes pleasure is exactly what you don't need, depending on the situation. So the tendency to reduce our reading of value simply to pleasure and pain is also part of that consumerist mentality. And it's just a very common widespread contagion, I think, that people have suffer from.
Well, let's touch upon that because we talk about the society we're in, and we like the ease with which we purchase things, and we don't complain about it in much manner. However, we do recognize that too much of a good thing can be just that, can be a vice, and that the ease with which we can now access what is perceived to be spiritual material in many ways is a degradation of it. It's what we talked about, the occulture, or the taking of that which was once a cult, and putting it so much into the framework. Oh, Brock, that the occulture, that notion of what was once hidden, and putting it so much into the public arena, the center stage, the public square,
Yeah.
that it actually degrades its inner virtue, its inner potentiality. That when you have pentagrams on everything,
Yeah.
and we see the same to some degree in Freemasonry. I know you're a Freemason, so am I. And I've said, I love Freemasonry, but let's stop putting a square and compass on everything. I mean, there's a reason the original pins were very small. It's so that you had to lean in and pay attention to it. You didn't have it on your gun holster and on your belt buckle and on your, everything. It's not a lifestyle. It's not a fashion statement. And we've taken a lot of this, we've taken symbolism and we've turned it into this fashion statement. And the notion is that magic will solve your dissatisfaction, the spell book of the week phenomena, and so we see people buying constantly. I've seen people, I remember years ago, I was looking at one young woman, maybe in early 20s. She had a stack of a half a dozen or more books, easily close to $100 worth of books or more. And I said to her, if any one of those worked, you would just need one of them.
Yeah. Well, and I think you can see where therefore the consumer product substitute for experience. Very often, the temptation is just to keep reading, but it's the doing that actually matters. I mean, there's a piece of wisdom here from New Thought, I think, when you read Napoleon Hill and some of the New Thought people, that the mental part is absolutely crucial in the beginning, but until it's translated into action, it's not wisdom. It doesn't have anything. It's mere potential in your mind. I think it's very tempting to do that. And consumer culture, of course, is about that because they can sell you the books. They can't sell you the practice. You've got to do the practice. So once you get caught up, I think, in this idea of having, if I have 50 tarot decks, that's not going to make me a real expert at tarot. That's all part of this kind of thing. So a lot of these things act as surrogates for the real work. If it doesn't work, you're not doing it.
Well, that's fascinating because it ties into two things. One is the notion of consumption and where we're at in terms of like being in the head of the dragon, where it's just that lunar node where it's just a head without a body, just eats, it consumes, or hungry ghosts. People, the ghost beings who have thin necks and big bellies, they can't get enough and they can never be satiated.
Yes.
So the notion of just more rather than focusing on something and saying, what is the end goal? Because I don't think people recognize when the end goal, and I had a discussion last night with a fellow, and one of his advisors told him, he says, well, you're gonna have to put in an hour and a half a day, 2 hours a day to make any progress in magic. And I said to him, and what is that progress? And there was silence. What are we talking about? What is the goal? What is the experience that you are seeking to cultivate, to seeking to have? And I think many people go into these experiences or into these practices without an understanding of what it is they're really after, other than an alleviation of their self-loathing or their suffering or their pain, or a very a really fair goal. I mean, I want a new girlfriend, I want a new boyfriend, I want a better car, I want a better job. I mean, this is all perfectly fine, but there's more to it than that when we start shaking up
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
universe. The universe has its own agenda too. That's, I think, part that's missed.
I think that's right. That's right. And all of those points I think are very much on target. How often, even having legitimate goals are things that people actually don't have. I think one of the things that happens, going back to this pleasure and pain thing, is that as long as I feel less stress and less frustration, it must already be a spiritual achievement. But if you're missing the signals that those are giving you, it's hardly a spiritual achievement. It's no different from you might as well just drink a lot of bourbon as do magic or something. You're basically just deadening something rather than expanding from it. But I think also part of what you're driving at as well is that there is a tendency, and this is also kind of part of the consumerist thing, is to substitute quantity for quality. Whatever else is going on, it's got to be a qualitative change that we're after ultimately. And you're right about having definite goals. And I think that it kind of goes in two directions. We want to work in an outer way to make our life more worth living, in an inner way to make us more capable of experiencing higher values like that. Because it doesn't do you any good to imagine what the wonderful life you want to have, but you yourself, you're not cultivating anything in yourself that could actually enjoy it in the first place, right? So a lot of times people have this fantasy that, again, it's this outer world change is what magic is all about. It certainly is that, but it's also internal change, so that I have greater qualitative capacity to actually appreciate higher values, being a fuller, richer person, being able to experience the goods that I'm seeking, hopefully developing virtues and other kinds of excellences of being human. And if those things aren't part of it, it's in the end a torso. I mean, I can get all the good things in the world, but if I have no taste or ability to enjoy it, or don't have the mentality of enjoying it, what good is it doing for me or for anybody else?
Well, I think that brings us to several questions. Then, is we've talked about uh, people talk about higher values and they love Jung, uh, or psychosynthesis, or this transpersonal stuff. And having been in many groups, having run many groups over the decades, I find that the two things that most quickly come about is we go from Jung, we drop off that mountain, go straight down to the base, and we hit Freud, because the problems that we run into with members are around, one, the ability to take and receive direction. That I find many people, particularly those who want to be in positions of authority in the group, do not want to receive direction. They want to give it. There's a power complex there. They want to be in charge. They want to be seen as an authority on something, which they're not. Or they may be on an intellectual level, but all it is a bunch of confusion. And then the other one is sex, relationships. I used to have to say, look, this is not a dating service.
Well, then why am I here?
Yeah, that's right. That's the other group. That's it. Go join them down the road. They have more fun. Okay. But yeah, that's the issue there too, between these two. And then there's kind of a third one, which is you kind of hinted at, where people don't really have much change, and that's true believerism. But true believerism is like a foundation. It doesn't really change, so it doesn't really disrupt anything, but it doesn't really grow either.
Yes, that's true.
It's kind of neutral in that regard. Oh,
Yeah.
okay, they're good. They're fine. They pay the dues. They're fine. But nothing happens. They don't really grow. They don't really do anything. But you could at least work on that. But you can't work with people who don't really want to take direction. And you can't work with people who have not come to resolve what are really a lot of very infantile, not even adolescent, but infantile psychosexual notions.
that's so true. I really think that, and you're right, going back to Freud on this. I mean, it's so much of it is about sex and Alfred Adler, about power. The sex and power complexes are very much at the basis of that, and that's something actually that Jung also held to. It's one of the things that is in Jung's teaching that maybe isn't always followed, but and certainly not picked up on. But especially in his clinical texts, he'll say that whenever he worked analysis, he always began with either a Freudian or Adlerian approach, which is similar to say it's got to be about sex and power, are usually the first things that have to be dealt with. And just as you're saying, that they tend to be infantile in us, and that they certainly haven't improved through the years since Freud, I don't think, or Adler. I think these issues of sex and power, like sex is out far more out in the open after Freud, but I don't think people are necessarily more mature in knowing how to deal with it. As far as power issues, there's a lot of things that also have to do with consumerism that I think actually tend to make people feel powerless. That is that, they think that when I buy this thing, everything's going to be good, and it's not that way. And instead of learning the lesson from that really you're just being manipulated by advertising to do this, they keep trying to buy more things, which are substituting for self-esteem and the kinds of things that would actually heal the power complex. So I think those are always there, and it's kind of it is one of the drawbacks actually that Jung is so popular amongst esotericists, because the parts of Jung that are popular are helpful, but they're not always picking up the actual parts of his understanding of psychopathology that would actually help. Because when we go into esoteric practices with our psychopathology, we don't deal with it. We simply amplify our psychopathology. Even if we get a little bit of this or that good thing from it, if we don't deal with this adaptively, like how do I have to change in order to make my life actually function well, I'll usually amplify the problems. As far as I can tell, people's power complexes and sex complexes tend to get worse unless they're straightforwardly dealing with it. That means dealing with it, I think, both esoterically and hopefully psychologically, if they can find therapists that can help them with that, which is itself a set of problems. I can't hear you.
That's an interesting point, because we see in esotericism often the discussion that, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. But then when we get into the nitty gritty of that, there's a lot of denial. And for example, people will often spend a great deal of time working on the positive aspects of maybe a sphere on the tree of life or planetary energy. And in order to enhance certain aspects, desirable qualities within themselves. And I said, well, whenever you do that, you ever so gently and unconsciously, and maybe even unintentionally, but it has to happen, bring forth its counterpart. It's what we would call clipothic counterpart. Because if you didn't, there'd be nothing to overcome. It'd be like weightlifting without weights. Or even any dynamic tension without any stress, there'd be nothing to overcome. You have to have something to overcome. Now, on the other side, we also see in contemporary culture the consumerism aspect of gourmet grimoires, expensive books, the idea that somehow if you have a very expensive library, that somehow that makes you a better occultist. All of this consumer approach to it. And of course, there were examples of that in the Renaissance, and where there's an explosion of publishing. And we saw in the 18th century the explosion of various high degree rites, which were essentially esoteric within Masonry, and they'd come and go. And however, the ability now for just overwhelming amounts of stuff is an obstacle, I believe, an obstacle to real progress, because people they don't know what to do often. They don't know where to go. And except, okay, if I buy more, this book will give me the answer, when it's not really the case. These practices and your careful observation of your experiences to them will help lead you to those answers. So with that consumer thing, we see then a lot of emphasis on Goetia, demonic evocation, fashionable evil, as I like to call it. And here again, what the people often forget is that the only way, if you read the text properly, you still have to do the opposite first. You have to call upon the names of God in order to control these forces. Yet that seems to be the thing they're rejecting or want to be fashionably. It's almost like, again, the adolescent rebellion against the father figure. Is almost their approach to evil. And you wonder, but what are you really getting into there? I mean, can you say? I mean, for most people, yeah, you can go along that route and nothing terrible may happen. But from an esoteric point of view, from the viewpoint of archetypes, uh, there lurks danger. Maybe you could comment on that for a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think that's really very true. And going back to your earlier point about collecting as many books as possible and things like this, one of the things that I have found that at least in my view come with the consumerist mentality, and I'm going to see if I can formulate this in a way that makes sense, is there comes a kind of feeling that freedom comes before decision. Freedom consists in having as many options as possible, not necessarily committing yourself to an option. And it's so much the opposite of what the traditional view of freedom was. Freedom didn't consist in having options. Freedom meant choosing one of them and then living with all the options that came as a result of the choice, right? So like you're talking about karmically, like a lot of things come, many of which we don't know. But we assume that when we make a choice, it's not only a choice for this, but it's a choice for all the things that come with it. So that expands our horizons. But in the consumerist sort of mentality, it's before you make a choice that you're free. It's when you have a ton of options. I often tell this story. I lived in Europe for 9 years, and where I lived was a fairly small, not a very populous area. And there were only 2 grocery stores. The larger of the 2 was probably not terribly larger than a mom and pop store would be here. But whenever I go into it, I always knew where everything was. I knew that everything would be of reasonable quality, that if there were crackers, there would be a good kind and a better kind, and that was the only option. I came back to the States, went to the Midwest, went to the big Myers store, and first time in Michigan, coming back, there was an aisle that must have been at least 75 feet long, all of crackers. And I was convinced that actually they were all the same. Like I stood in front of all the options, not knowing how to make a choice, because not only did I have, not only were there too many choices, so I didn't know where to start, but the 2 major companies had the exact same cracker, even the same colors on their boxes, just a different name. So the interesting thing there was that I actually felt paralyzed by too many options. When in doubt about what to do, you don't do anything in some cases. And so I think it's one of these things that happens when we get so absorbed in having lots of opportunity rather than making the most of what opportunities in front of us, is also something that counteracts freedom. So the interesting thing is that we think of freedom as having options when freedom is actually choosing one of those options.
That's really funny. I'm reminded of a friend from college who used to go in the store and says, "Oh, I hate all these choices. Generic is good. A black on white label. I just want to see beans. That's all I want." And I said, "Oh, so you do very well in the Soviet Union then, except there'd be no beans."
Right. Yeah. Yes. Exactly. Yeah. There can be extremes in both directions. I
Yeah.
think. As usual, we miss the opposite extreme. That's also a problem. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Well, I see that all the time with students. Paralyzed by choices. They
Yeah.
want, well, what's the best one? Well, that's like trying to get a car, right? I mean, first of
Right.
all, what's the best vehicle, not car,
Yeah.
vehicle for what
Right.
you want to do with it? And
Right.
then what's your price range?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
it's the same way with esotericism or spiritual practice. What is it that you are trying to achieve, and then what is your capacity
Yeah.
in terms of time, in terms of uh, inclination, in terms of resources, inner and outer, and then you begin to formulate a direction.
Yeah.
And maybe at some point that direction will even become narrower and become a path.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and so consequently, you have to allow yourself to grow in that field with the best lights you have, not finding the best, because you yourself haven't articulated yourself enough usually to know yet what's going to be the best. But to assume that if you go into it with the right intention, that you'll come out with the best at some later time. But that assumes patience, it assumes slow growth. It assumes, again, counter to the consumerist culture, I'm not going to get gratification right away, that I'm actually going to have to go a slow process. I'm actually going to have to do meditation, for example, consistently, rather than moving to the more glamorous types of things of, ritual magic and things like that, like have these constant practices. But all of these things that are part of the consumerist attitude, I think, tend to rail against the good habits that one needs, both for psychoanalysis, incidentally, as well as for spiritual practices.
Well, I just said that to someone recently, and I put it down in writing. I said, look, spend your day meditating, develop a good meditative practice, learn to have a dialogue with your inner self. It doesn't have to be meditative absorption. You can just deal with learning how to do inner dialogue, which is very, very efficient. And it's actually a fairly advanced practice. Many people think of it as a just beginners. It's not, because that inner dialogue actually develops into auditory responses that will allow you to have that experience that's called knowledge and conversation with your holy guardian angel. It actually is an auditory response you get. It's not just visionary stuff. So learning how to move towards that and relax and within your own mind, be comfortable with yourself. And I said, do that every day. And then on the weekend, have a big ritual. I said, it's like, every day you go to the gym, right? And then what do? You don't go to the gym on the weekend usually. You often then go, hiking or biking or some sports. But that's what all of that was preparing you for. And then your cycle begins over. So, but I said, if you're going to do ritual magic every day, you're setting yourself up for really some potentially, I don't want to say catastrophic, but it could be, but extremely problematic situations, because it's a lot of intensity. Um, and even that wasn't done every day. You look at people, they went into retreat to do that. They didn't do that in the world. They did extensive practice in retreat for 3 months, 3 years, 3 weeks, whatever it happened to be. And then they stopped. And a lot of people are reading from books. It's, again, book learning versus having a relationship with someone who has experience. And they're thinking, well, the book said I got to do an hour and a half of, every day, 2 hours a day. And then what?
Yeah, exactly. That's right. You're reminding me of stories of people like Abraham Lincoln, who, maybe only read 3 or 4 books, but read them over and over again because he realized the quality of them was such that each time he came back to them, he was a different person. And there's something similar, I would think, that one would want to do in this case. You're better off finding the things that seem like they're really speaking to you, not just gratifying you, but speaking to you as pulling on you, grow out of yourself in certain ways to expand yourself. And you keep going back, because as a new person, each time you'll also get more from it. But you've got to be able to do this internal adaptive expansion that I'm talking about. That has to be, in my view, the fundamental commitment in all of this. If you don't have that, and you're not doing everything you can with that being sort of a piece of what your definite purpose is, I don't think the other things are going to work so well.
Well, I think that internal adaptation being the focus point, then we see, along with commercialism and consumerism of esotericism. And again, it's always been there. It's just a matter of extremes and whether the notion of paralysis comes from it. When you had the vast publication again of alchemical texts in the Renaissance, I mean, we can say that was a commercial aspect. And many of them were just written for the sake of, like many of the grimoires now, they're not really good texts. They're just fashionable. Someone can make a coin off it. But at the same time, we also saw good production there. We saw some societies, private, semi-private groups for different reasons, uh, that were able to move forward. We saw many of these Masonic or quasi-Masonic movements in the 18th century that then would flower esoterically and lead us to the occult revivals of the 19th and early 20th century. So we've seen good things come of it. At the same time, what we also see, contemporarily speaking, is an emphasis on external action, virtue signaling within occultism. That is, it takes on the expressions of mostly liberal and progressive politics, and really is little more than a reflection of the prejudices of its own age in many respects, its biases, you know. And with that, there's an unwillingness to go to extremes individually, internally. There's an unwillingness to go against that new status quo. For all the talk of being heretical, for all the talk of being transgression and transgressive, the fact is you can find nothing more blasé, mediocre. What other words can we use? Non-challenging than your average occultist when faced with, the doctrine of political correctness.
Yeah, no, I
And
think that's
and we
correct.
could say therapists as well, therapists and teachers.
Certainly, certainly, yeah. I think this is one of the reasons why Jung understood individuation in two different ways. He both understood it as this inner adaptive expansion that I'm talking about it, but he also understood individuation to stand over and against the collective. Right, that if you're too swept into the collective, and that's not to say that a person could be too anti-collective too. That's also possible. That doesn't seem to be the main problem nowadays. It seems again that a broad consumerist mentality includes somehow always being part of groups in some way, but not, you're part of groups, but you're not part of communities. A community is different from a group. Jung tended to understand all groups as being basically collectives, which meant that they tended to join in unconsciousness. People were just joined together with a lack of awareness of what's going on, and that's why they were joined. They were just kind of, vaguely involved in a group for the group's sake. That's different from a community. There's one text where he does make this distinction, and it actually merited more discussion than he gave it. But where he understood a community, you're part of a group in a way that you don't renounce your individuality or your individual destiny. That's the difference between a community and a collective. And I think part of his notion of individuation as distinct from a collective is that he recognized, as many people did in his time, as Karl Jaspers and existential philosophers and so forth at the time, that we're living in what was going to become a mass society, that people would lose their self-definition in favor of group definitions of something. So that to learn how to, number one, differentiate oneself from a collective, and then secondly, hopefully to find communities, that is places where people are joined together consciously in a pursuit of high ideals of some kind, but without surrendering whatever their individual destiny is. A healthy community always has the group and the individual in tension with each other, not one at the expense of the other. And those are hard to find. It's hard to come by.
I think for myself, when I look at the difference, excuse me, I see community as much more earth-oriented because something comes of it. There is a tangible result, and it survives or dies based upon some very real choices that are made. Whereas a collective, this group think, tends to be very airy and idealistic. And it expands and it inflates people's sense of importance, expand and inflate. And the two aren't necessarily separate, but that inflation can be suffocating, as it literally takes all of the prana, energy, life force out of a room, pulls it into itself for its own expression. And it's what we talk about when we talk about the negative aspects of an egregore.
Absolutely.
It is a consumption. It is a living thing that eats everything in order to expand itself.
Yeah, that's right. I think this point that you're making, especially the inflationary point, is really important. One of the great Jungians, arguably the greatest American Jungian, was a guy named Edward Edinger. He has a very famous book called Ego and Archetype, which is about the kind of the religious archetype. And one of the things that he says early on, and this is not verbatim, and it may be a little bit more my language than his, but it's the basic idea is that any kind of growth that we have psychologically, and I would say spiritually, includes a certain amount of inflation, because you need an inflationary energy to pull you out of the ruts that you're in. And you're essentially saying, God damn it, my life matters. And so I'm going to go for it. And it has an inflationary quality. The inflation itself isn't the problem. The problem is if it remains inflationary rather than be reassimilated in what I'm calling expanded adaptive potential. anytime we make this move toward really affirming our own life, which should also be at the core of our spiritual practices, that is, that my life matters so much that I'm going to throw myself into it and submit myself to it, it will always have this inflationary energy. But the inflationary energy is meant to be reassimilated as expansiveness. I think collective inflation as a rule doesn't do that. Collective inflation is usually more like a venting than an inflation that's a fruitful inflation that can become something that helps expand potential, because the group both kind of provokes it, but it also sets the parameters. So you're not necessarily pulled out of your channels into directing yourself toward your ultimate destiny.
Well, let's pick up on that on a very practical and technical level. Many people often like to do, meditations on the heart. And, having done many of these and seen different expressions of them, we can see people who will often approach heart meditations as a spacious concept. You see that in different Tibetan practices where the notion of openness or space is there. Uh, this, I believe, tends to be mostly in Dzogchen. Here in Western practices, we tend to look at the heart as a place of fire, a place of transformation. So we see the meditation on the heart as fire. However, we see many people also going into heart meditations, excuse me, from the approach of yoga. And there, the psychic center tends to be meditation on the element of air. And what happens there is we see with that expansiveness of air, there tends to be tremendous confusion that can arise in people, particularly with regards to relationships. So we see as people expand, if they're not rooted firmly in their own body, if they're not rooted firmly in their relationships, if they're not rooted firmly in the world, they've done the preliminary or other work, we'll say below it or beneath it, so to speak.
Yeah.
They tend to get airheaded. We see them, they get flights of fancy, delusions of fantasy, um,
Association.
disassociation. Uh, Everything is lovey-dovey, and next thing you know, they're leaving their husbands usually for the pool boy or something, and or whatever these yoga divorces, what they call them, dharma divorces, that are so prominent, because that expansiveness is untethered. It's
Yes.
untethered, it's not, it's just overwhelming. They're not integrating anything. And of course, they take it for the summum bonum, the ultimate, forgetting that there's more to do beyond that. And Dubuis talked about this a bit in some of his, Jean Dubuis, that is, in some of his writings, because he said many people have this experience, and the feeling of vastness and openness and goodwill can be so great that, they'll don't give away all you own. Don't do this, and don't feel the need to preach the new religion.
Right.
That can be an aspect of that expansiveness, that it becomes, because it's unintegrated,
Yes.
it becomes pathological.
I think that's right. Yeah. There's a philosopher from the early 20th century, Max Scheler, who's always been sort of a philosophical hero of mine. But one of the things that he talks about is this kind of psychological contagion that happens in those situations. And there's a way, and this is kind of the difference also between collective and community, in my view, is that in a collective, there are these kind of sweepings through of energy that one almost loses one's agency in the process. Whereas in communal sensibility, like I was describing from Edinburgh, if you get inflated, if that inflation is about you taking control of your life, that's great. But as soon as you're just taking an experience in its expansiveness, without raising the question, does it have a shadow side? Well, then chances are you're just going to go from one extreme to the opposite extreme and not get into the in between. The old Kabbalistic idea here that the middle way is the wise way. It's very true. In each of these areas, we can get to some extreme and, like you say, completely lose our moorings without realizing that when we've been one-sided in an area, the opposite side feels like relief without realizing, well, yeah, but it's got its own sides. The middle way is where you're trying to get. The opposite is trying to move you to the middle. It's not so that you give up everything you once had, so you go to the opposite extreme. Both extremes are neurotic.
Maybe you could talk about the shadow for a moment. We hear that phrase a lot, and uh, I know that I've spent more time than I would like listening to YouTube presentations on it. And usually in the background as I'm doing dishes, by the way. Okay. So maybe you could just pick up on that point and give us the authoritative definition and explanation. So I've put you on the spot here of what the shadow is.
Yeah.
And why the shadow knows.
Yeah. I won't claim authoritative statement here, but the main thing about shadow goes like this: is that Jung thinks that anything that counts as neurotic is being one-sided. He really does have that kind of Kabbalistic middle way in mind. The idea that, as a rule, wherever we're finding that there are adaptive problems in life, one piece of it is always that we're too one-sidedly something at the expense of something else. The something else is what's in the shadow. That is, whatever's in the shadow is the part that's actually a compensatory balancing part of ourselves that we're ignoring, that we're somehow defended against, that we don't want to touch on in some way. And looked at from the standpoint of us as human beings trying to grow, that's a good way to describe it. I would say that through my experience as a therapist, a lot of what goes into the shadow isn't simply things that we're defended against. They're often things where other people whose love we're concerned about keeping, that they don't like. So in other words, I begin to reject a part of myself because I'm afraid the person I love is going to reject me if they know about this. Or maybe they've sent the message to me that they don't like it. Or, so in other words, from the pure standpoint of the person experiencing shadow, it's primarily his or her one-sidedness and ignoring the thing which would bring balance. But I would say experientially, whether it's from parents, whether it's from a spouse, whether it's from a beloved friend, a colleague, there's this feeling that something about me is objectionable. So rather than me working through both why that matters so much to me that somebody else objects to it, or whether I think what they're thinking about me is valid or not, I simply reject a piece of myself. So oftentimes the shadow, I think, at least in my experience as a therapist, is comprised of things that a person dislikes about themselves, but they usually dislike it because somebody else sent them the message that they ought to dislike it. And so a lot of this freeing oneself up from negative relationships that often happens at the beginning of good therapy is also coming to grips with how have I felt like I had to sell off a piece of my soul for love.
I think that's a great point because I see that in so many people, particularly when we do virtue signaling, which is the now obsession among the intellectual class, or what likes to think of itself as the intellectual elites of our cultures. And that includes therapists, that includes teachers, that includes academics and philosophers. And with that, then the occultists who like to see themselves as somehow either part of that or the cutting edge of that. They like to see themselves as the spear point of culture in many ways, if you will. And that whole notion of the shadow being something which, excuse me, I am told not to be.
Yes.
And sometimes, things that you don't need to be everything you want to be, because not everything you want to be may be good for you because of karmic inclinations and habits. Too much of something, again, we have to balance that out. However, Yogananda liked Westerns.
That's right.
You have to become comfortable with yourself.
Yes.
And what I've noticed is when people seek to conform too much, again, the notion is excess,
Yes.
to what external world is telling them, it's because they don't have an inner guidance themselves. They don't have enough of an inner compass, trust in themselves, confidence in themselves. And I see people who for decades, for their entire lives, have underachieved and just repressed and suppressed so many parts of themselves that they become explosive. And then they feel guilt over it because they've become explosive, because they want to be a good person. They want to be a spiritual person. And this goes back to what Jordan Peterson said. And, I said it before him, so I don't mind quoting him, is that, nice guys finish last, because, studies show women don't want nice guys. What they want is the alpha male, and then they want to marry the nice guy who's going to take care of the kids. But what they want is an alpha male. and we this ignoring of certain biological imperatives and the psychology that often goes around that is possible in our civilized framework. But when you get into esotericism and magic and you get deep inside your psyche, you ignore it at your peril. In fact, you can't ignore it anymore because you're asking it to come out into your world.
Exactly. That's exactly right. There's one of the things that some of my Jungian colleagues and I have discussed sometimes is one of the things that we think Freudians do better than Jungians is deal with aggression. That aggressive energy is an important factor in life, and you can't just sort of ignore it. And one of the tendencies can be to over spiritualize it and say, oh, well, I wouldn't want any aggression. So it's like saying you're not a mammal. Mammals have aggression. That's what we do. My dog will run out in the backyard. If he sniffs something he doesn't like, his hackles go up and he's on his guard. That's because being a mammal is having aggressive energy. But people confuse the idea of having a certain type of energy with acting a certain way on that energy. Right? So aggressive energy, just by way of example, doesn't have to come out in aggression towards somebody. It can come out in other ways. For example, the virtue of fortitude assumes aggressive energy. It's a channeled aggressive energy that makes us stick with something. It's the capacity to keep up with something, to do something all the time. Or aggressive energy of itself will tend to be one-sided. Aggressive energy with a certain reasonable sensibility brings out assertiveness, which is not a bad thing. So there's a tendency to conflate the energy with the way in which it comes out. And so what happens oftentimes, and especially in contemporary collectives, is that the energy itself is condemned rather than the way that the energy should come out. And so we don't get the structures, the social structures to help us, whether as men or women, but there are different ways in which aggression comes out. We have to find ways of saying, no, I'm a mammal, so I can't just ignore or suppress the aggression. That just means it's going to come out in some other way. Instead, I have to find a way of giving expression to it that's also tolerable, that also seems like, again, it's developmentally helping me in some way. And aggression is one of those areas where I think we don't do that. It's just automatically considered toxic without any further ado, so that one suppresses it. And all that does is make for a much more implicitly violent culture than one that's explicitly so, because there's no way of dealing with the thing that's out in front of you. So there are a lot of ways in which people act, for example, passively aggressively all the time. It doesn't mean there's no aggression. It means that it's under the surface. It's not being dealt with. So a lot of the things that I think have kind of broken down over the years, and it's not all bad, but it's not all good, is finding ways, structures whereby these things can find expression. And that certainly had an effect on masculinity and other areas as well. I wouldn't restrict it to that, but I think it's definitely there. And learning how to deal with one's aggressive energy, not in a repressive way, but in a way that enriches a personality, because there are other ways for aggression to come out than outright aggression. It's aggressive energy that needs to be transformed into something that's enriching to the personality. That I think is extremely important. And I don't see much going on in our society that gives us a way to do that.
Well, I think this ties into the psychosexual aspects too, because the notion of aggression and sex are intimately connected, particularly if you've ever dated a Scorpio girl. And, you know, th- the notion here is about, what is the nature of life? And it's about really the exchange of genetic energy, either through sex or through eating it, So
Yeah.
it's about, what is the genetic information that's going to move forward? And so both of those are intimately related. So we see that within the notion of identification in terms of I-ness, the I, as we say in yoga, the I-ness. That same energy is also the energy associated with Kundalini, just that it's in a different expression. It's instead of overly identifying and limiting, Kundalini is identifying but expansive. But taking this further, much of what you described is very similar to what we saw, because of you're in Pittsburgh, and of course I'm here uh, just south of Scranton, and both of us have some knowledge of the recent, well, it's going on about 2 years now, what is Attorney General's report on the Roman Catholic Church sex abuse scandal that was decades long, of course, across Pennsylvania. And I believe in the 60s, there was a analysis, a psychological report presented to one of the cardinals, I think it was in Boston, although I'm not certain, with the priests who had gone into therapy to deal with their their abusive tendencies, their sexual abusive tendencies. And it stated that many of them functioned roughly on the level of a 12 or 13-year-old. And that in many ways, celibacy was the problem. And what I'm saying here is that what you had is an idealization of women, in which women is put on this pedestal and mother-fied, it's a mother identity. And then, of course, all of the energies are directed towards this in a very kind of childlike manner, but the individual's physiology is more going towards adulthood. And there was no mechanism for the sublimation of that energy. There was no, it was just repression. There's no sublimation. So the intellectual and the emotional development of the individual stays stunted. And I was talking to a friend last night who was in criminal law, and we were talking about, the bishops that we've met, and you would meet them, and it was like talking to a child. Okay, I mean, this emotional sense of like, oh man, and you say, okay, this dude's not right. So you could see this in many of them, and many of that I've met. So that repression creates an explosive tendency that must find its outlet, but it can only do it on its level. So they could, they're molesting children because they're adults physically, but inwardly they're children.
I think if you don't have ways of helping uh, spiritually awakened young men whose psychic energy has gone largely into spirituality, if you don't teach them how to awaken into a mature sexual being, whether they express it or not, or like you say, have a sublimation, it's a recipe for problems. One person in the esoteric tradition who saw this pretty clearly actually was Dion Fortune. You see in some of her texts, including some of her novels, like The Goatfoot God, she has this whole kind of discussion on this, where she understands the transference. What Freud calls the transference. That is, where my unconscious, the things I haven't dealt with, either through projection or through, what's the blanking on the other word, but anyway, that it's projected from the unconscious onto the other. If that work can happen toward the Blessed Virgin for a celibate male, but that includes eros, real eros, that it's not an empty twiddling beads, but actually is something where the personality is involved. So it's eros finds an outlet of idealizing a woman that can still be an idealizing that's actually conducive to growth as a mature being, then it'll work. And if it doesn't, well, then you're going to have this problem that you're talking about. And it's interesting that I think it also went the other way. One of the things that really wasn't widely known in Catholic mystical tradition, I think until the 70s and 80s, or at least wasn't written about, was the extent to which the great women mystics of the Middle Ages felt their primary devotion not to the Blessed Virgin, but to this humanity of Jesus. And there again, you can see where it's an attempt at bringing out a mature sexual relationship that doesn't have to be expressed sexually, but is sublimated in a certain way. There's really to the humanity of Jesus, which is not necessarily the great emphasis of medieval spirituality, which was so much on the divinity said of Jesus, but really the humanity that was part of it. But the point being that the great mystical traditions did what you're saying should be done. But I wouldn't necessarily say that that's always been achieved as well as it was in the Middle Ages amongst the mystics at that time.
I think it touches upon something really important, and it has to do with fragmentation, not just fragmentation of the individual, but in many ways fragmentation within social structures and the strengths and weaknesses that come with that. I mean, there's a plus and a minus with all of these things. And within esotericism, we have a significant fragmentation today where, again, magic, particularly that which of the Golden Dawn structures or Golden Dawn style structures, is taught as if it's separate from mysticism. And of course, there's this passing mention of therapy, but it rarely happens. And we've seen within our own experiences, people who would run many of these groups, many of them, not just GD, but many types of groups, don't have the psychological wherewithal to take on the problems that groups will bring, particularly their own. So you see a lot of projection, transference, and countertransference taking place. Esotericism, or the notion of esotericism as a culture, that is a inner culture, rather than a thing that you do or a thing that you wear, was really first brought to my attention within, the philosophers of nature with Jean Dubuis. And of course, many of the approaches they have there are, while the methodologies may be more modern, the philosophical view is older. It's more rooted in the European tradition. So when we see such things as like Meditations on the Tarot, a fabulous book that has much information on it, even if you don't find the Gothic Catholicism appealing to you, the fact is it's a stunning piece of work. And it points out that esotericism is a cultural view that integrates astrology, alchemy, mysticism, personal gnosis, and then with that artistic expression and scientific exploration. It's all of these things. It's not the book on magic. Um, how do we get at least to that reintegration, which is another term we hear in occultism, reintegration? Now, how do we work on that, and maybe on small groups even, and move forward?
Well, that's a great set of questions. I wish I had the answer to all of that, but I will say I don't think it's insignificant that the ancient esoteric practitioners were usually groups of people who were also philosophers, and I say that because a philosopher meant something generally different in those days, maybe than it does now. Academia has domesticated philosophy into into an academic discipline alone. But that's not the way Plato or Aristotle or the great philosophers would have understood it. It certainly was about knowledge, it was about wisdom, but it was also about prudence, and it was always about the cultivation of the soul. Right. So the old idea of virtue, the word virtue signaling you brought up a few times. It's unfortunate that the noble word virtue is being used that way, because there was a time when virtue really meant the cultivation of one's inner life, and primarily one's instinctual and desire life, so that it would become consistent with a life project. You can probably hear in that how much that's what you've been talking about, and what you and I have been discussing here. That is that it was generally understood that there's a teleology to the psyche, that is, that we're after eudaimonia, which translates roughly as happiness, but where happiness means not only the experience of joy, but means the joy in experiencing my full humanity, experiencing all of my powers being somehow developed or cultivated. The very word culture comes from cultivated and cult. The very idea that I'm worshiping God's cult, that I cultivate my personality, and that I form a culture based on that, it all assumes that there's something really positive that can be done with human nature and really needs to be done. That's why when one studied philosophy amongst the old esoteric groups, it wasn't simply for knowledge. It was actually also so that as a group, you're rubbing elbows with other people and learning how to become a better person through the challenges of that. It's always like the Masonic image of the rough ashlar. You're rubbing up against each other, and you only learn virtue in part from that. I think having an esoteric culture that has neither psychotherapy, which in some ways is the contemporary version of the old philosophical communities, although I don't think it's missing some of what those old communities have, and also having philosophy not understood as abstract theory, but understood as the idea that I am always in all throughout my life trying to cultivate my better self into a coherent narrative about what brings fulfillment to me, and how in doing that I'm also serving others. Those kinds of questions, I think, have to be essential. And I don't see that going on very much in esoteric books either. I don't see that as being quite central. Whereas I think without that, I have a hard time seeing how magical and esoteric practices will do much other than amplify people's negative complexes.
Well, what we see is a political philosophy, and its de facto checkbox virtue or moralism now becomes the expression of that better person. You're a better person because of blank. what I was thinking is when you were talking is that virtue, in the gospel it says Jesus is touching as my virtue has gone out of me. Virtue is a real power. It is not just an abstraction. It is a psychic force that is not, again, not just in some psychological sense, an inner force, but it is a psychic pneumatic force, that moves in and through us into the world and then back again. It is the essence of the entire magical practice, is the cultivation of virtues. And on the tree of life, you see the different virtues and vices are attributed to the tree and to the different spheres. And you look at earlier practices, the cultivation of virtues and qualities was essential before you got magical teachings, or
Yes.
what we would call the various tantric teachings, outer tantras, inner tantras. You had to have certain qualities about you before you'd be trusted with the potential increase in energy, because the energy, again, is like gasoline going into the motor. Not only that, but we're changing the motor. You're going from 4-cylinder to 8-cylinder now. We're gonna give you high octane on top of it. Well, if you're still a Volkswagen, that can be a problem.
That's right. That's right. And that was the idea, is that I have to be the sort of person who has the capacity to deal with that energy. And if there's no cultivation of that, and I do think, a kind of a depth-oriented psychology is a piece of that, but I also think that the developing of virtue is another piece of that. If I'm not even trying to do that, then I'm not going to have the capacity. I'm not expanding the adaptive capacity, as I put it earlier, to be able to tolerate those kinds of energies. There are too many examples of people, not just burning their fingers on this, but having more decisively bad things happen to them through this process, which shows the importance of this virtue issue. And I would also add to that, going back to your point about mysticism as well. I think in a lot of ways, magic needs to be lived mysticism. It has to be the sort of thing where it's mysticism in practice. I'm not saying that magic and mysticism aren't differentiated from each other, but I think they're meant to dovetail with each other. And the person can go a mystical route and not go a magical route. But I think anyone who goes the magical route needs also at least to be a mystic to some extent, so that that's what gets activated and expressed. That's also part of this virtue point, I think.
Well, that's kind of what theurgy is. It's the combining of the two when we look at it.
Exactly.
I was thinking when you were talking there about the um, famous again, Golden Dawn, just because it's so well known to people, not because it's the only example, but it's well known. That's why we bring it up. Is story where many of the members, and they were all high degree members, they were advanced members, were going to do an invocation of the spirit of Mercury. And I had not known this until recently, but apparently uh, that operation was put off for a considerable period of time because so many of the people came down with what were described as, and of course we only have the notes, the details aren't known to me, as these atrocious, horrible illnesses. Yeah, and the forces, when we begin a movement in a direction, they get the memo before we do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Action, reaction. And, when we look at that group of people, that organization only lasted for about 12 years. If I remember correctly, at its height, there were about 300 members, of which maybe 50 of them or so were in the Adeptus minor grades and above, if I remember correctly. So all of which people now get in their book and immediately go to, that was not restricted, but that was not well known. There was a process before you got that. So we see people not only trying to skip that process, but to do it on their own. And this only amplifies the potentiality for their, at best, just confusion. I'm just confused. I don't know what to do.
Yes.
And at worst, which of course we have no way of knowing how often this happens, maybe some real unraveling. And probably between those two extremes is the middle ground of a lot of muddling around and meeting people who may know what they're doing or may think they know what they're doing but don't, and you're getting all sorts of bad advice and mixed advice. What do you suggest to people to do? I mean, what do you suggest to students as to begin to approach their spiritual path. What will benefit them in this Kali Yuga in which we are in?
You always end up with a note of hopelessness there, Mark. I don't know. Well, I would say that for myself, I would say both these two things that I've emphasized, both a depth-oriented psychotherapy and some understanding of this traditional idea of virtue would be helpful. Now, the traditional idea of virtue is in some ways more difficult to get than the psychotherapy is. There certainly are places. My Roman Catholic past is an important source for myself and understanding virtue. It's one thing I think Roman Catholicism has done fairly well, not always in the confessional, but at least in its understanding of moral theology, that it's not simply about what you do, it's about what sort of person you become. So maybe that's the crucial question that has to be asked. There's a strong emphasis on doing rather in contemporary ethical theory and thought, what have you done, rather than who do you become? After all, if I become a generous person, I'll generally do generous acts. You don't have to ask whether my acts are generous. If I'm a generous person, you're going to know 95% of the time they will be. If I'm an honest person, you'll know that what I'm saying is generally going to be the truth. It's going to be a rarity that I'm not telling you the truth, right? So instead of focusing on acts, which only happen here and there, to focus on the cultivation of a personal attitudes and stances. Virtues are habitual stances and attitudes toward the world that become embodied in acts. The lack of sense for that, understanding what virtue is and how to cultivate it, is a problem. Now, I think, like I say, Roman Catholic tradition has a lot on that. Freemasonry, of course, hinges on that. It may depend on what lodge you're in and which Freemasons you know, but certainly the idea of how I'm describing virtue is certainly central to what Freemasonic philosophy is about. So that's another potential source for that. When it comes to psychotherapy, depth-oriented therapies, meaning largely, psychosynthesis, Jungian, Freudian, existential, Gestalt, they're all various modalities that are trying to deal with issues of the unconscious. But it is important that when one deals with the so-called unconscious, that one not be satisfied with the unconscious. I think there is a tendency, I don't know how else to put this except sort of in generalities, to say that oftentimes when psychological traditions gain a lot of credit, people who are in those traditions tend to make it a philosophy of life. And that's a weakness too. No matter how great, how diverse psychological theory is, it's not talking about the totality of life. It's talking about a part of life, and that part is usually the part that has to do with consciousness and below. So it doesn't solve the problem of how to relate to the superconscious, which is largely what we're doing in esoteric practices and spiritual practices and mystical practices. What psychotherapy, good psychotherapy, does is necessary so that the more primitive forces in us don't run amok. Those have to be managed and controlled. So that is part of this. The cultivation of virtue is also a part of that, so that you're also understanding where your complexes are kind of driving you to two extremes, one way or another, like we talked about before, too much one-sidedness or flipping to the opposite one-sidedness. But there also has to be, a real practice, I think, of meditation, mystical practices, various kinds of ascetic practices even, that should be part of our relationship to the higher world. And so I think you kind of need all three of those to get sound. And part of the difficulty there is that we don't have robust traditions. Catholicism and Masonry are both robust to a certain extent, but we don't have robust traditions to give us the virtue part of us. And the shadow of psychotherapy traditions is that they too easily turn into philosophies of life rather than philosophies about an important part of life.
Well, that's something that we see having maybe a high point in an area that is of interest to you, which is the Renaissance. That in many respects, the Renaissance and Renaissance magic seems to be the point in which all of these things for us in Western Europe and in the Mediterranean area are fully and coherently synthesized. And that from there on, there's increased separation or degradation into different individualized parts. And those parts then become overemphasized at the expense of the whole, just as we as individuals may overemphasize one aspect of ourselves at the expense of the whole. I know one of the things I was taught very early on was the notion of personality versus character, and that, our personality changes. When we speak to each other here and now, we have a personality, and it's different than the way we may deal with our neighbor or our spouses, but the character remains consistent. That is that which is reliable and dependable. That part of us, which is what you're referring to as the virtues, that is consistent, and that is really what we take with us along, into the other worlds, into future lives. Along with that character, of course, is not just these emotional notions, but very real capacities.
Yes.
That is, and so how do we develop these capacities? Of course, we have different esoteric practices for that. We teach them at the Institute. But I know you and I have talked, and maybe we can push you a little more on this, about you maybe doing some classes for us. What are your thoughts on that? What if you were to do a class or two for us, what would you like to do it on so that we can whet the appetite of our listeners?
Well, I would certainly be interested in talking more about Jungian esotericism, both the strengths and the weaknesses of the Jungian approach. And some of what we've talked about here is part of it, where too often it becomes the whole entire philosophy of life. I think that's where we find certain limits in Jung, but also seeing the strength of it because of the way in which it relates us to processes that are unconscious and also superconscious ones. We just didn't call them superconscious. Although, as you pointed out to me, Miguel Serrano, insisted that he did talk about superconscious, but he just didn't do it in writing, that he did it on his deathbed. It's a very interesting set of issues. I guess that's a good time to start talking about the superconscious, at least. So I'd be certainly interested in that. One of the things that we haven't talked much about here is new thoughts. I find a lot of value in new thoughts. It seems to me a very kind of straightforward, psychologically attuned tradition. It's not as strong in symbolism, of course. That's not its strength, but its strength as far as psychology is concerned. It's something that's not only amenable, I think, with good depth psychology, but frankly, I use it in some ways clinically. Because I think oftentimes even depth psychologies have a tendency to stop at insight, but not necessarily help. Okay, what do I do with the insight now? And that's where I think new thought's very helpful, because it allows you to use imagination as the workshop of developing what sort of person do I want to be, which answers the question of virtue and also answers the question of what's my definite purpose, as they would put it. What is it that I want to do with my life and how do I do it? So those would be two areas, for example, I'd be very interested in. In fact, I recently taught at the Philadelphia Jung training seminar on Western esotericism and its clinical significance. And I talked a little bit about looking at Jung, not only looking at esotericism from Jung's standpoint, but looking at Jung from the esotericist standpoint. So I kind of made things ambivalent on purpose to try to talk about this. But what you brought up about the various vices and virtues, for example, that go with each of the sephira, was one of the things I talked about, because you can find that people at different levels of individuation are often having precisely the struggles that are represented in the sephira. So there's a lot of possible things that we talk about there that's of interest.
Yeah, well, there's so much, and I know we could go on for another hour or so, particularly opening up the can of worms of new thought, which, of course, as you know, is near and dear to me. And just leaving it at the notion of imagination. That imagination is the hinge. That's all the forces of our subconscious, of our unconscious, where we withdraw necessarily from the stimulation of the world and create an inner world, an inner simulation, an inner stimulation. And then from that, we either escape and create a kind of psychosis, or we project it forward and outward and create a new life for ourselves, or we create within ourselves an access to other dimensions that transcend our limited and narrow sense of self, which is what all of this ritual path working, tantric practices, all of these things are about. So for those listening, you can always go to the Institute for Hermetic Studies, to our Teachable page, and enroll in some courses. You can get our monographs and books and learn how to use those tools. And hopefully I can twist John's arm a little tighter and get a class out of him before the end of the year, before things go back to normal and he doesn't have his time on his hands.
Very good. You won't have to twist very hard, so don't worry about that.
Great. Well, John, thank you so very much for being here with us, and I thank you. Everyone, thank you for listening, and have a great day.